On today's show, we'll be talking about some LA Kings prospects, including Quinton Byfield. What happens to him next year? All coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalakeche, usually joined by Sebastian High, who couldn't make it this time around. And on today's show, we'll be looking at the LA Kings' top 3 prospects, I would say, at this point. First and foremost, we'll look at Quinton Byfield in detail. What happened this year? What happens in future years? Does he maintain his growth? And a lot of these clips will include segments from my appearance on Locked On LA Kings. Make sure to check out Eddie Garcia's content over at Locked On LA Kings. Great podcast, great show. I was glad to hop on. So I've got a couple clips to share from that segment just to get the conversation rolling. In our second segment, we'll look at Liam Greentree. Was he good value at 26 overall? How did his season go? I'll show you some clips from the podcast where I talked about him in detail as well. And especially we'll look at his skating and how does he improve it, as it is a weakness. And then in our final segment, we'll look at Brandt Clarke, the big right-handed defenseman. We'll review his past year in the AHL and the NHL. Does he play full-time next year? I'll also show some clips about my appearance on Eddie Garcia on that subject as well. And what his upside is in the NHL. Where does he end up? We'll get into all that on today's episode. As usual, though, if you're watching on YouTube, remember to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rating review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So let's get things started right away here with our segment on Quinton Byfield. Now, I want to talk about his season this past year. An impressive season after putting up 10 points a couple years ago, then 22 points the year after that. Finally exploded for point totals and played a full season in the NHL with 20 goals and 35 assists for 55 points in 80 games played this past season for the LA Kings. Now, I put out a full-length video breaking down Quinton Byfield's improvements, on my personal YouTube channel with voiceover, tape, analysis, all that good stuff. But I'll also just kind of basically sum up what I've talked about in that video with this clip here from my segment over at Locked On NHL Kings, where I had a conversation about Quinton Byfield this season with Eddie Garcia, including a little prediction I had made, I'd say 6 months ago, I want to say. It's been a while. It's been a decent while since I made that prediction, and it's turned out pretty well. This was before, actually, no, that was more than 6 months ago. This was before this past season that he had, Quinton Byfield. So let's play that clip right now and show you what I'm talking about.
And I did want to talk to you about something that you mentioned on our show in a previous appearance. And at the time, a lot of Kings fans were panicking about Quinton Byfield, the second overall pick in 2020. He had played about 100 NHL games, and they were calling him a bust. But you would come on the show, and you said, in 3 years, Quinton Byfield was going to be the best player on the LA Kings. Well, the following season, this past season, a bit of a breakout season for him, 20 goals, 55 points in 80 games. And a lot of those people that were screaming he was a bust have now sat back down and taken a deep breath and said, okay, maybe I was wrong about that. They look like they're going to move Quinton back to his natural position of center this season. Yep. Just wondered what you think about his trajectory, and you're still feeling good about what you had to say on our previous show.
Absolutely. I actually put out a whole video of on that on my YouTube channel, kind of breaking down the improvements in Byfield's game and how he kind of went from a player who relied a lot on his skill in order to kind of get into open ice, deke through a layer of defense and kind of get to the net, to a player who really became an off-puck wizard, really a player who mans the boards really well, who spins off checks really well, who anticipates rotations in cycles really well. He became dominant off the cycle. And that's really the kind of improvement that I expected to see at this particular stage of his development, which is why I made that projection, is because these players usually develop in this way. These big, skilled players, they've had to rely on their size. They've had to rely on their size advantage, rather, pretty much the entire time they've been in juniors, right? Their whole careers have been bigger than everyone else. So they never had to develop a real awareness for what's going on around them, an ability to anticipate and predict play and read things in advance. But Byfield's really adaptable. He showed that in his draft year when he kind of started using his hands a bit more to open up ice, his ability to draw players in. He started adapting to the OHL level Then once he hit the AHL, it was kind of the same thing where it was a bit of a slow progression, but by the time he had figured out how to anticipate play and not exclusively rely on the size advantage, he popped off in the AHL, and the same thing happened in the NHL. So, when you have a player like this, when you're bigger than everyone else, obviously you don't really have to you don't even have to really force out muscle guys. It's just kind of effortless to you. But once that competitive advantage disappears, once you reach the pro level and defensemen are as big and as strong as you are, what do you do? So that was the reason why Byfield took some while to figure out his game. But I'll make sure I'm obviously doing a self plug here, but if you refer to my video, I break this down in detail with tape and analysis and voiceover. There's a way to do it that Byfield is kind of perfected that made him incredibly dominant, on the boards, especially in the offensive zone off the cycle. So that's a key progression in this game. And yeah, I kind of saw this come. I was just really excited to actually have some videotape to break down, and we finally got that this season. Some great examples this season of how these big skilled players usually develop, especially when they're as skilled and as intelligent as Byfield. Alrighty, so hope you enjoyed that little clip from Locked On LA Kings. Again, remember to follow them and watch their content, whether that's on YouTube or or wherever you get your podcasts. Wherever you're listening to this or watching this, you can find that podcast and that episode. It was a great show. I had a bunch of fun talking about LA Kings prospects as well, just around the board there for the LA Kings. So yeah, overall, in terms of the improvements with Byfield, like I mentioned in that clip, the ability to work the wall, the ability to improve his board game, and especially his ability to up his game, 2, 3, 4 steps in terms of his ability to not exclusively rely on his size to win battles, to get off the boards, really starting to use anticipation and leverage and kind of processing and kind of clever tricks in order to compensate for the fact that he basically lost the size advantage when he reached the NHL. Yes, he's still bigger than average, but it's not as big of an advantage as it used to be. A lot of these defensemen are 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", 200 plus pounds, and are able to handle his kind of physical abilities. So the question is, moving forward, does Quinton Byfield maintain this growth? Was this a kind of permanent step up in his game, or is this kind of a temporary kind of flash in the pan type of situation with Byfield? Now, I think it's the former. I think that with Quinton Byfield, there's been a key improvement in a key area of his game that needed to be addressed moving forward. I think that this gives a great blueprint for what a prospect like Caden Lindstrom could become and what his timeline to greatness could be. I don't even think Quinton Byfield's reached a ceiling. I think he could get even better than this with even more improvements to his anticipation and in predictive ability off the cycle, his ability to man the boards, to become dominant in those situations. He's already there to a certain extent. He certainly hit that gear in the second half of the season there with LA, but I still think there's room for even more growth in what Quinton Byfield can bring to the game. So I don't really think at all that this is kind of the end of what we see here from Quinton Byfield in terms of his overall progression. I think it's just going to go up from here. It's going to continue improving. He's going to continue getting more and more comfortable using his skill in key moments in the game. I feel like he relied a lot on cycle plays in this past season, which is exactly what I wanted to see in terms of the immediate kind of axis of progression for him. Is go all in on board battles, go all in on anticipating cycles and reading your teammates' routes off the cycle. Go all in on that for a season or two, and then kind of readjust as you go. Use the rush a bit more, use your skill a bit more. Because Quinton Byfield's always been a dominant, player in terms of both physicality and skill. It's just a matter of being able to combine those two elements and make them consistent element of each area of the offensive play. So off the cycle, on the breakout, off the rush, on the power play, every situation where you create offense, Byfield still has to learn to kind of add everything together. So for me, overall, I just see Quinton Byfield getting better from here, and I'm really glad that prediction ran true with hindsight there. So again, this is exactly kind of what I saw happening with Byfield. These players tend to adapt. You watch Tage Thompson, it took him a couple years, but he figured out how to use his skill in combination with his size and not exclusively rely on the fact that he was, 6'6", 230 pounds, right? It took some time to adapt that level of kind of gelling his skill game, his finesse game with his physical game in order to make him an efficient NHLer. And we're seeing the exact same thing with Quinton Byfield. And already started this as a prediction. I think we're going to see the same thing with Caden Lindstrom as he progresses. So I think Columbus has got a fantastic prospect on that end, and another prospect who might take a couple of years in order to develop properly, but by the end of it will look fantastic. But that's our first segment done. We'll get into our second segment here where we talk about Liam Greentree, the recent first-round pick of the LA Kings at 26th overall. We'll look at whether or not he was good value in that range, what his season was like. I'll show you a clip as well, and also we'll talk about his skating and how he improves it. All that coming up in just a second. But just before, a quick word from our sponsors at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophies, also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED kits, headlights, and much, much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has exactly what you need. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, for your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every single time or your money back. Because with eBay Motor, you are burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home the winning trophy. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Alrighty, so let's move right on to our second segment. We're talking about Liam Greentree and his kind of progression over the past year, what he's added to his skill set. We'll talk about that in the segment I'll show with Eddie Garcia. But just before, let's talk about the value here at 26 overall. First and foremost, I mean, we're talking about a prospect who I personally had in my top 20 pretty much all year, excluding maybe the first couple of months of the campaign where I saw Liam Greentree a bit more of kind of just a static shooter, a guy who kind of collects pucks in the offensive zone and kind of shoots rebounds at the net and that kind of stuff. He went from that to a really multifaceted prospect. And this was on a team that he had no business being as good as he was on. He was a captain of the Windsor Spitfires, scored 36 goals and 64 assists for 90 points in 64 games. What a season there from Liam Greentree. He truly, truly dominated for that team. He was a focal point. I think he led him by 24 points, if I remember correctly. So by far and away, the most utilized and most relied upon forward on the Windsor Spitfires. And yeah, overall, just a fantastic season for him in a not ideal situation. And as I mentioned in the clip as well, Liam Greentree was one of only two CHL prospects in terms of drafts eligibles who had a C on their jersey. It was him and Tanner Howe. Both of them were kind of in the same situation where they were both on an island in terms of production. They weren't really well surrounded. But I'll get into why that really doesn't matter too much for me in the clip that I'm going to show here with Eddie Garcia from Locked On LA Kings. But just to summarize whether or not Liam Greentree is good value, 26 overall, I think he definitely is. He has his weaknesses. We'll get into skating later on after the clip. But overall, I think that the improvements in his game, the way he added intelligence, awareness, processing, the way he's compensated for his lack of skating stride has been more than good enough. So yeah, for the moment, let's just roll that clip from Locked On LA Kings and the show I did with Eddie Garcia that's coming up right now.
So let's obviously get into the LA Kings, and we will start at the top with their first selection. The past 2 years, they did not have a first-round pick, so I know a lot of Kings fans were excited to finally get that first-round pick this year, and it ended up being forward Liam Greentree. The Kings actually traded back to get him. They had the 21st selection and then moved back to 26 and got him. Before specifically you tell us about Liam Greentree, what did you think about the Kings as far as where they were able to get him?
That was, I mean, it wasn't a surprise on Sebastian and I's end at Locked On NHL Prospects. We had done a mock draft. We had actually mocked Greentree going 25th to Boston. So we had an idea that he would slip. Mainly has to do with the skating. We'll get into the details in a second. But just to summarize, at 26 was about where Sebastian and I expected him to go, more or less. Pretty surprised that Boston didn't prioritize Dean Letourneau. Obviously, he's 6'7", but he was playing Canadian high school hockey, essentially, which isn't the highest level of hockey. I expected them to maybe take a swing on Greentree, but good for the Kings. I mean, this is a prospect I had in my top 15 pretty much all year.
I know in one of the shorts that you had put out about Greentree, you had compared him to a former LA King in Tyler Toffoli. Certainly you can get into that if you want, but just kind of tell us about what he brings to the table. Obviously, you know, the things that he excels at and the things he needs to work on.
Yeah, for sure. So there's two players in this draft that reminded me of Tyler Toffoli. Liam Greentree is the kind of bigger version. Tarek Parasak is a smaller version. He went 17th overall, I believe, to the Washington Capitals. Both of them is kind of the same principle, that in order to be a good NHLer while being a poor skater, you need to be an elite off-puck thinker. And Greentree's certainly an elite off-puck thinker. At the start of the year, he looked very much more like a kind of static shooter, just a finisher around the net. But the more I watched him throughout the year, the more I saw glimpses of a player who really thinks the game at an advanced level. His playmaking game really took off. He was the captain and the points leader by a decent margin for the Guelph Storm. No, for the Windsor Spitfires, rather. And overall just dominated that team. He was the focal point of that team on and off the ice. So great leadership abilities. And it's the same thing with as with Toffoli. He's a poor skater. He doesn't accelerate really well, doesn't get on his outside edges as well, can't cut corners really tight, and can't forecheck as well. But he compensates for that with elite positioning, elite off-puck thinking, great off-puck movement in order to get into open ice and get some shots off. He's certainly a scorer, but he's definitely upped his playmaking game 2 or 3 kind of notches above what I thought he was at the start of the year. It really, really improved as the year went on. So you've got an intelligent player who can pass, who can shoot, who can handle. He's got pretty much every single one of his goals this year was a highlight reel goal, especially starting the second half of the season. He was dangling guys, moving to the backhand, driving the net. He's got a great toolkit, and he's got a big frame at 6'2", almost 200 pounds. So he's a player who can bring that physicality, but also brings a high level of intelligence. And that's a toolkit I really value in a player.
When you look at a player who's clearly the best player on his team and maybe the best player on a bad team, how do you factor that in? On the one hand, he's the guy doing everything. He's not getting any help. But on the other hand, he's the guy who's the focus of the entire team, perhaps offensively, right? You're always going to try and set him up or get him the puck or give him the most minutes. How do you kind of balance that out, if you know what I mean?
For sure. So, with Greentree, he was playing more minutes than I think all of Windsor's defensemen. Like, he was playing major minutes for them. So when you look at the point totals, you kind of factor that in. His points per 60 are probably going to be lower than a prospect who's the third or fourth or fifth most utilized player on his team, but is putting up as many points per 60. It's just that he's getting less minutes, right? With Greentree, the other side of that is there's a reason he's in that position. There's a reason why his team trusts him so much, gave him the C as a draft eligible. There are only 2 draft eligibles in the entire CHL, so OHL, QMJHL, and WHL, who had a C on their chest. It's him and Tanner Howe. And Tanner Howe was in the same position. He was on an island in Regina. So it's not just a matter of lacking that surrounding skill in your team, but it's also a matter of looking at, why is this player in this position? Why is he the one that's being trusted? Is it because of a lack of options, or is it really because he deserves it? And for me, in Greentree's case, he really deserved it. He really upped his game, like I said, throughout the year. He improved almost on a nightly basis with the way that he approaches the game, the way that he thinks the game. So by the end of the year, I was really impressed. There were some kind of lackings, especially in the final stretch in the U18 Worlds and that kind of stuff, but I still think that Liam Greentree's got more than enough in the tank in order to be an NHLer. All right, so that was Eddie Garcia and I on Liam Greentree, where we discussed kind of the overall game, the improvements in his game, and why his skating doesn't really cause too much of a concern. But I also mentioned that it would still uplift the rest of his game if he was able to improve his skating stride. Now, how does he do that exactly? That's the main question here. And I think it's fairly simple. There's 2 kinds of development for skating. You've got your mechanical skating issues that are fixed with mechanical skating coaches like Barb Underhill and those kinds of coaches who, by the way, if you haven't looked into Barb Underhill's work, she revolutionized Braden Point's skating stride. She made Nick Suzuki much more efficient and a much better skater overall in his game due to kind of working on his mechanics. So mechanical skating coaches are really good at one thing, and it's kind of reworking your skating stride from scratch and making you a better overall, a less wasteful, I would say, skater overall. Because that's the main thing with skating strides is when you're putting in more effort than you're getting out of each stride, you're going to waste a lot of energy. And when you waste a lot of energy, you start needing to pick and choose your spots where you're spending that energy within your shift. So with Liam Greentree, the way it would manifest, he would kind of take his pedal, he would take his foot off the gas on forechecks in rush and zone entries, for example, or situations like that. He would kind of default to static plays instead of kind of keeping his feet moving. And it's mainly because he didn't have that much energy to spare. So he couldn't go all in on every play. So as he improves his skating mechanics, he's going to get less and less wasteful, a lot more efficient with each stride. And it's going to seem like his work rate just came out of nowhere. But what you're actually seeing is a prospect whose skating stride's improving. And at 6'2", 200 and something pounds, it's not very clear right now what that is. As a left shot right winger rather, Greentree has some very interesting skills to work with there. Great physicality, some great elements on that side. But in terms of the improvements to his skating, it's just to say that the other side of the skating improvements, which is power skating improvements. So when your legs aren't strong enough, when you can't get enough muscle behind each stride and aren't really as powerful in your stride as you need to be, that side, Liam Greentree doesn't need to worry about at all. He's got legs like tree trunks. He can get it around the ice more than well enough. So I'm 0% concerned with that side of his game. Now, in terms of how to improve his skating, I think that's the side he's going to need to focus on, his mechanical work, how to improve that side of his game. If he can get his mechanical skating up to par, I think we've got a decent prospect here. But I don't, like I said in the clip, I don't really think it's as necessary as it is with other prospects to improve his skating, because he's already found ways to get around the problem in really intelligent and clever ways. So yeah, that's my take on Liam Greentree, and that's our second segment done. We'll get right into our third segment where I talk about Brandt Clarke in detail. We'll review his past year in the AHL and the NHL. We'll review whether or not he should be in the NHL full time next year, and we'll look at his upside in detail. Does he end up as a second pair defenseman, a top pair defenseman? All that and a lot more in just a second. But just before, a quick word from our sponsors at Indeed. If you're looking to hire for your company, Indeed is the best place to get it done. It is the matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and it has a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. And yes, I said matching engine because you're not searching for candidates, you're matching with them. That's a really important part of that. You can dish the busy work and you can use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging all in one spot on top of that. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. One of the things I liked about Indeed as an employee when I got hired through my day job through Indeed was that it was super easy and transparent. You know exactly what the job was looking for in terms of qualities, in terms of responsibilities, and you could easily look at that and say, yeah, that matches my skill set. That matches what I'm able to do and what I know what to do and what I know how to do. So as an employee, it's a super easy and efficient tool to use. So I can only imagine how much better it is for employers. And listeners of the show get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/locked on. Just go to Indeed.com/locked on right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Again, that's Indeed.com/locked on. Terms and conditions apply, but if you need to hire, you need Indeed. Alrighty, so let's close this thing off with our discussion on Brandt Clarke here of the LA Kings prospect pool. He played in the AHL this past season. He was the 8th overall pick in 2021, and he had a really good season in the AHL. 10 goals, 36 assists for 46 points in 50 AHL games, and then had a cup of coffee in the NHL. Scored 2 goals, 4 assists for 6 points in 16 games with the LA Kings. Now, in terms of what happened this past year, it's not just the point totals. It's the overall improvements with Clarke's overall game. I mean, this was a prospect who I felt added the concept of timing really, really well in this past season. Before that, it was just kind of an average element of his game, but it really turned out to be a strength here in this past year in the AHL. And I think that's what got him his cup of coffee, is his ability to understand the ebb and flow of an NHL, of a pro game. He's a prospect who always thinks 2-3 steps ahead. So understanding timing on top of his anticipation of play, his processing of play, knowing when to make the right pass, with which weight to put on his pass, and how to control tempo in a pro game the way that he did this past season in the AHL was key in order to improve his kind of impact on the pro game. Overall, when you have a prospect with this level of skill, with this level of intelligence, sometimes you can see them miss the mark because they're kind of over eager or not eager enough. I felt like Brandt Clarke really hit the nail on the head in terms of timing in this past season. He really developed that aspect of it. Now, the question is, as he grows and develops, what happens to him as he kind of climbs the ranks and gets into the NHL? Does he have to readjust his timing to the NHL pace of play? I think he will, and we'll get into that in the clip I'm going to show right now. This is a clip where I talked about Brandt Clarke for a couple minutes there with Eddie Garcia. Talked about overall kind of whether or not he'll be playing full-time in the NHL and which type of role he's likely to occupy right away off the bat. So let's play that clip.
Another Kings recent first-round pick expected to play his first full NHL season this year. Defenseman Brandt Clarke, 8th overall pick in 2021. Had a solid first pro season in the AHL last year, has had a few tastes of NHL experience here and there. What do you think about his path to the NHL on schedule, and how impactful could he be this year?
Yeah, in terms of impactfulness, it's a bit difficult to say because there are still some limitations to Clark's game. His skating is all sorts of weird, and I think that's a bigger problem for defensemen than it is for forwards. So, I wouldn't head into this season with the expectation of Brandt Clarke becoming a top pair defenseman and kind of dominating this team, obviously, but I still think he's going to have a decent role. He might move from the third pair to the second pair and kind of make that his home with the LA Kings for the time being. He's just so intelligent, so aware. The things I talked about with Greentree, compensating for your lack of foot speed, your lack of agility, with great off-puck positioning, great awareness. That's exactly what Brandt Clarke has been doing his entire career so far. Heading back to his junior years, this is exactly what I saw from Brandt Clarke as a prospect who thinks the game ahead, who sees a game 2-3 steps in advance, and is able to position himself proactively rather than rely on his foot speed to stay with guys. Now, as he reaches the NHL, and you ask any AHLer that moves up to the NHL, their first comment is, "My goodness, this league is fast," right? That might be a hurdle he'll need to overcome. But just like Quinton Byfield, I think he's skilled enough and I think he's smart enough in order to make that adjustment. It just might take the same amount of time it took Byfield at the NHL level to understand how that works, to figure it out in a way that works within his skill set. So I'd preach a lot of patience with Brandt Clarke, but I think at the end of the day, you've got a top 4 defenseman. He's certainly got the skill, smarts, the awareness, and the defensive stick work to make it work. Alrighty, so let's review that. Essentially, as I mentioned, with Brandt Clarke, you're going to have a prospect who I think is going to take some time to adapt to the pace of play in the NHL. That's a comment from every single AHLer that plays their first NHL game is, man, this league's fast. So overall, I don't think that's going to be anything new in Clark's case. I think he's going to go through the same experience on that side. But for me, the main question with him is, is he able to reach a top pair potential? He was drafted 8th overall in 2021. A lot of people, including myself, had him even higher than that due to his intelligence, due to his processing of the game. Is he a top pair defenseman for the future for the LA Kings, or is he a second pair defenseman and one of the best second pair defensemen in the NHL at his best? I think it's more likely that he ends up as a number 2 defenseman. I think he's going to be kind of the complementary piece on a top pair, a guy who's going to think his way out of problems, going to pass the puck up the ice, who's going to play probably either on your first or second power play, depending on who else you have, probably going to be on the first power play. It's just, for me, it's the composure, the intelligence, the awareness, the anticipation, and the newfound sense of timing that he's developed over the past year. The mental elements of his game are so well refined. And as I mentioned in the clip with Hadi Garcia from Locked On LA Kings, I think that when it comes to players who have these skating concerns like Brandt Clarke has had for the longest time, like Liam Greentree does, the question is, can they compensate for that with being elite off-puck thinkers? I think Brandt Clarke is an elite off-puck thinker. I think he's got that ability. On top of having somewhat improved his skating stride over the past couple of years. He's nowhere near as bad as he was in his draft year. He's not necessarily a good skater or far from a great skater, but he's not a terrible one either. He's able to get around. He's able to shift his weight and get around a forechecker or that kind of stuff. So he's able to use his footwork fairly well. He's just kind of limited in how far that footwork can take him. But overall, players that have that weakness need to compensate with being great thinkers, and Brandt Clarke is absolutely that. On top of being highly skilled, highly composed, highly aware, I like overall his chances of being a number 2 defenseman. I think being a top pair defenseman, a number 1 defenseman rather, is out of his reach, mainly because I don't really see the skating, especially, in the first half of his career in the NHL. It might take him a while in order to learn and develop the experience that it takes to defend with lower end skating. Skating affects defensemen much more than forwards when it comes to their overall impact on a game. I think Brandt Clarke's going to need to adapt to the speed and strength of forecheckers, especially on retrievals, as he's heading back towards, behind his goal. It's going to get a bit difficult. It's going to get a bit muddy in terms of how fast he can process a game on that side. But I think with enough time and enough experience, especially in a top 4 role full time, I think Brandt Clarke's going to be one of these prospects who, by the time he's 28, 29, 30, really reaches his full potential and becomes a top pair defenseman for a couple of years before before his prime falls off, essentially. So like I said in the clip, I would preach a lot of patience with Brandt Clarke. It's going to take him, I think, as long as Quinton Byfield took to find his game. I think it's going to take just as long for Clarke to find his game as well. So I wouldn't expect a fully fledged Brandt Clarke before maybe 24, 25, 26. And then defensively, for him to become elite might take a couple more years. So that's my prediction on that side. But that is our episode done. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, again, remember to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment down below, letting us know what you thought of the episode, who you want us to talk about next, all that good stuff. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rating review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next shows as we continue our prospect coverage for the month of August and head into September. This has been Hadi Kalakeche, usually with Sebastian High. We hope you tune in next time.